Clever.
Well, I want to thank all the participants. I've been involved with a lot of trade and policy issues, but you really get an extraordinary sort of combination of perspectives here. So we have a little time to have a bit of a panel discussion. And I was very pleased to see that, Mark, you mentioned some of your students are here as well. Maybe if we have a little time, we'll take a few questions from people in the audience as well. But let me start with a topic that Carla raised, Trade Promotion Authority. Mac, I think, offered some extremely valuable insights on the politics of trade. And I think all of us who have worked on trade know it's a fascinating area because on the one hand, it involves all the details of the most complex foreign policy issues. It's very much linked to domestic politics and policy as well. I'll just add that I was so pleased that after President Clinton made the huge effort, which he did for NAFTA, that his popularity rose.
Absolutely. Yep, exactly.
And at a time when the American people seem to be looking to see whether Congress and the President can get something done, I actually wrote a piece in the summer of '93 making the argument that I honestly thought this would be a real boost for President Clinton as a way of pulling the country together and leading. So we have another opportunity now with Trade Promotion Authority. As all of you know, we've got the State of the Union tonight. You've had a Trade Promotion Authority bill that was introduced by Senator Baucus, the Democratic chairman of the Finance Committee, co-sponsored with Orrin Hatch's Republican counterpart, Dave Camp, in the House. And frankly, one of the big issues, in a way, as Mac mentioned, is will this be a priority? So I'd like to start actually with a little bit of the counterpart perspective on this. Maybe to help an American audience understand something that looks a little technical and complex. How would Canada or Mexico assess the U.S. action or inaction or delay on Trade Promotion Authority, and how would it affect your view of the U.S. commitment on TPP or trade more generally? So Luis, why don't we start with you and then we'll come to John.
I think it's very important. I mean, it's difficult for countries to, the agreements are relevant to the extent they are ambitious. And without TPA, I think the level of ambition will be put in question. I mean, we need to convince countries that are reluctant to put significant things on the table, like Japan. I mean, why would Japan put something on the table that might be reversed by the US Congress? So having a rule, the TPA is a congressional rule that will allow more certainty for negotiators, I think is very important. And it sends a signal. And little will happen without US leadership. And TPA, I think, is the first component to that process of leading back the world and making sure that bipartisanship takes hold in D.C. Maybe it's something that is, even bipartisanship is much more of a bad word than NAFTA. But I mean, little will happen without significant commitment from the leadership in D.C. And I think this is the time to do it. I mean, I think we should be expecting difficult economic conditions in Europe, in Asia. North America is blessed with more opportunity. So let's do it now and convince the public. I mean, the NAFTA was the first agreement that really captured the public debate. Before NAFTA, all debates were negotiated in secret. Now that's gone. Well, now it's make the case publicly and begin with the TPA process.
Thanks. John?
Well, I think there are two main problems with asking for TPA and not having TPA. And the first one is it's not at all clear that you'll have an outcome at the end of the negotiation, because you see real differences in the debate in Congress, the possibility of a competing bill coming forward from the Democratic side in the Ways and Means Committee, uncertainty about what's going to happen when Chairman Baucus leaves. So, to put all that effort and difficulty domestically into a negotiation, including putting forward difficult concessions potentially. You know, if you go to one of your constituencies and say, this agreement's really important to us, so actually we're going to put the thing that you've told us not to put on the table, we're going to put it on the table. And then if that agreement goes nowhere at the end, you get all the political wrath from these people who think they've been betrayed, and you get no political kudos from the people who would have benefited if there had been a deal. And even worse, in a sense, is this problem of picking a deal apart. I mean, we've learned how Congress works with amendments and so on. So, and the problem, therefore, is not just whether the agreement would be approved in its total, but whether all the pieces of it that have been painstakingly negotiated and put together as a balanced package will remain there or not. And if you're putting difficult things on the table for your country, you want to make sure that those things to which you attach importance, which might be difficult for the other side to put on the table, you want to make sure that that sticks at the end of the day. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to start unraveling. And certainly no government wants to be put in the position of going through that. So I think it's, frankly, that the countries now negotiating with the United States will be very reluctant to move forward to the end of the TPP negotiation until it's clear that the administration has the authority from Congress to conclude a deal and to see it approved.
Mac, you spoke very informatively and I thought eloquently about some of the politics of this back in the Clinton period. And to give you and President Clinton, I think, even more the credit you deserve, it's not so easy for a president in the first year to pick up a priority left by his or her predecessor. And I think that what was really important from the outside, and this reflects the way President Clinton works, you could tell he engaged himself.
He did.
And I think for all of us, who'd been in the trade negotiating business, you can do a certain amount as USTR. Mike Froman, I think, is putting his heart and soul into this effort. But if it's not backed by the president, the machinery of the White House, it doesn't happen. Now, constituencies change, the politics of this change, but share a little bit of your perspective on the TPA today.
Yeah. Well, Bob, first, thanks for your your kind words. They're greatly appreciated, mean a great deal coming from you. I think what we really have are some just enormous cross currents, and that reflects the feelings of the people in our country, which Tim and Jim and others that have served in Bill and in Congress understand and have seen firsthand. And by that I mean, I think John's got it right. I think 60% of the people reflect that we've got to have some level of engagement. They understand the world's interconnected. Exports are critical. They understand in a broad way the North American platform. On the other hand, there's a lot of insecurity in our country. One of the things that helped us is the economy was getting better. The more secure people feel about their futures, the more likely they are to lean forward and support engagement in the world. But there's also a feeling, as you've seen, about the United States has overextended, pulling back. I think that's more on traditional foreign policy issues than trade issues. So there's just a lot of cross currents. But I think you've got to come to the basic conclusion that while all politics is local, and that goes to the specific sectors and industries, and trade is tough, as we all know, but you cannot lead in the world without engagement and without being successful on a bipartisan basis on this type of agreement. You just can't. And so I think TPA is a moment in time right now. It will take presidential leadership, and it will take a constructive, responsive attitude from the other side of the aisle to get this done. And one thing that we did pretty well is we were able to bring former presidents, former Secretary of States, former USTRs together and really validate, affirm that this was a bipartisan effort. That helped. And I still tell the story about Carla Hills giving people 5 people to call in the Congress. And Carla, I truly think we had 25 CEOs either report to me or to Mickey Cantor saying, I got my 5 done, here they are. And so it's that kind of local engagement that makes a real difference. But it's difficult, Bob. There's just no way to understate it, but absolutely imperative at this moment in time in my judgment.
Well, Carla, you and I were talking a little bit before about some of the erosion on some of the Republican constituencies on this, and of course there's always a sensitivity about giving a president of the other party power, particularly as these agreements start to cover more topics. So what would you suggest?
I think the suggestions in our panel are right. It's going to take leadership, and ideally it will take presidential leadership. I think back to before we started the negotiations, we had to refresh, renew, fast track, now called Trade Promotion Authority. Now that wasn't easy, but I personally met with 535 members who were my very best friends to talk about this issue. I canceled all travel for about 45 days. And President Bush Sr. would have people like Danny Rostenkowski down for lunch and talk about these issues. And it truly makes a difference. Without leadership, it just doesn't happen. So if you feel that there's a void there, that's where groups like this come in. Because if you can energize your members, and if everyone stands up and says, you know, I will talk to 2 members, I will tell them why we can't get the Japanese to put rice on the table because they're terrified that they're going to take the political heat at home and come home without anything. So it's important that we say we'll negotiate the agreement as the Constitution said, with the president negotiating with foreign powers. He'll bring his product back. Now, the Congress doesn't like it, vote it down. If it likes it, vote it up. And I think we have different people that want to keep protections or subsidies or advantages that perhaps we in this room might think are not constructive to economic growth. We have to have enough to be able to say to them, and I remember going to the textile manufacturers' annual meeting. I wasn't applauded, but I said, look, to get this agreement will give our economy a boost. If our economy has a boost, you will benefit. So you can either look backwards and hold on to your special interest, or you can join the march to expand our economy and our nation's growth. And I think that we really need to persuade our elected representatives from the top up to come out and speak out on the importance of this issue.
Just 3 quick observations. I just came back from Singapore and China over the weekend. And what I wish I could even communicate more vigorously to members of Congress and the administration is how an issue like the TPP and the TPA related to it is so integrally linked to America's presence in East Asia. Mac made this reference, and I did as well. I don't think it's totally fair, but given the adjustment on some of the security issues, there's a question of is America withdrawing? Right. And in a sense, as a counterpoint on some of the military engagement, you have an active trade and economic agenda. If that is seen as collapsing back, the implications for broader stability and opportunity, I think, are going to be very significant. The second, however, goes to a point that Luis made. You know, when you look at the TPP, for people trying to understand this, the United States is negotiating with 11 other countries. Of those, 6 we already have free trade agreements with. 5 of the remaining, you've got Brunei, not exactly a big economy, New Zealand, important, but primarily in dairy, Malaysia, medium-sized, you got Vietnam and China, are the 2, or Japan are the big ones. And Luis mentioned a key point. The Japanese see this agreement as part of a broader reform and revitalization of their economy, the so-called third arrow of Prime Minister Abe's reform effort. It's better to call it a quiver because it's more than one arrow. It's a lot of arrows in it. And to be frank with you, the negotiations in December, what I understood was the case is that Japan's negotiators basically said, oh, well, there's a December deadline, we'll stonewall, so we won't act on these things. So if the United States is not ready to close a deal and carry it through, I think you're not only going to have the problems we talked about, it's going to have implications for Japan's reforms, and that has implications for broader East Asia. Last point, and this goes back to Bill Frenzel's legacy. You know, I think all of us have been in the administrations of any country realized no one person can do this. It has to be an organized effort. And to complement the Clinton White House, getting Bill Frenzel and Bill Daley to sort of coordinate an effort was critical because in politics you need momentum. You can't, these issues, you can't get CEOs to do this for a year. You have to kind of rise to a crescendo. So when that moment comes, and it seems to be now, you have to get organized, and so we'll need either this Bill Frenzel or another one to be able to help with a Bill Daley counterpart to organize the effort. I want to come back now. Luis mentioned something that Carla had also talked about, and this has been a big part of Mac's legacy, the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly enough, we had the idea that President Clinton launched of a free trade area of the Americas for various reasons with some of the countries who couldn't quite reach it yet. But as Carla mentioned, the United States and Canada now have free trade agreements with over 50% of the non-US GDP in the hemisphere. And particularly the formation of the Pacific Alliance that Carla alluded to, I think is a very interesting not only economic venture, but in the contest of ideas in Latin America. So again, Luis, start a little bit. How would you think, as we talked about transatlantic, we talked about trans-Pacific, what about the Western Hemisphere? What are the opportunities here to take the Pacific Alliance, Central America, North America, and use that as a foundation for something bigger in this hemisphere?
Well, I mean, the agreements that we have in Latin America are the consequence of the NAFTA. I mean, that just underlines against the importance of the agreement we did 20 years ago. I mean, Mexico negotiated a network of agreements in South and Central America with Chile, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, but Hugo Chavez canceled it. And then with the whole of Central America, just because we did NAFTA. Now, I mean, in Latin America for years, we've talked about integration, but nothing ever really happened. And the Pacific Alliance is something completely different because this is for real. I mean, it's already there. It's working. It's very ambitious. It covers the whole areas of disciplines, from goods to services to procurement, to some degree of labor mobility, to student exchanges. And there is a long list of countries that are either observers or want to apply to join the Pacific Alliance. I mean, it's a transformational agreement because it changes the psychology of trade in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, we used to compete against each other to sell in the U.S. I mean, if the Colombians had preferential access to the U.S., Mexico saw that as a competition to our exporters, and conversely. But by having agreements among ourselves that are high-level discipline agreements, I mean, we begin to see each other as markets, but more importantly, we begin to see each other as partners. And if the Pacific Alliance is successful, I mean, we'll transform the region because it will put enormous pressure on Brazil. I mean, Brazil is a very competitive country, potentially. And Brazil has to choose one day whether it will globalize itself or not. In Mexico, we've done it. Brazil will be one of the largest economies in the world in the next 20 years. So will be Mexico. But we are coming from different types of strategies. And I think that convincing Brazil to join in opening its economy so that they are more competitive, I think is crucial. And the Pacific Alliance that creates a rim around Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and then Central America will be tremendously influential. And this is the debate that we have to win in Latin America. I mean, we have now Latin America divided in 3 blocks. The Pacific bloc, which is the countries that are more inclined to have open trade. The ALBA countries, that are Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Argentina, that are more inclined to have closed economies. And then Brazil in the middle. If the Pacific Alliance is successful and a non-Latin America country joins, like Canada or Australia, I think the impact on trade policy in the region will be enormous.
So Mac and Carla, you've both spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I think Luis really put his finger on the real challenge of Brazil. So how do you see this going forward?
I think that if we get a major trade agreement, whether that be the Pacific Alliance or we get the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that it will have an enormous catalytic effect to the world at large and Brazil in particular. I think back to when we were negotiating the Uruguay round. It collapsed in Brussels in 1990, in the December of 1990. In 1991, we commenced the negotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, June of 91. We completed that negotiation in August of 92. President Bush Sr. signed it in December of 92. President Clinton and Mac McLarty and Bill Frenzel got it over the hump and got it approved in the fall of 93, and it was effective in 94. Within 4 months, the negotiators came back to the table, 123 trade ministers, and completed the Uruguay round. There was a standing ovation in the Western Hemisphere, and they said, we've got to have free trade by 2005. Well, we didn't make it, but there was a momentum. And in Asia Pacific, there were the Bogar goals announced in 1994 as a result, in my view, across the board, of the tremendous catalytic effect. Call it competitive liberalization is what the Peterson Institute calls it, that caused people to think more about trade. We get any one of these major trade agreements, and I'll tell you the rest of the world will not want to be left out. And so we've got a lot of multilateralists who say these bilateral and plurilateral agreements are eroding the system. If we get one of them, in my view, and I'm a fervent multilateralist, in my view, we will get Doha back and going on. So that's a plus. But whether we get the Pacific Alliance that shows Brazil the right path, or whether we get the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TTIP, we could make a huge difference, but we need one of those.
Mac, I'd like to get you on Latin America, and then John, I'm going to come to you about this issue that Carla raised about the integration of the regional with the WTO and global.
Well, Luis gave a splendid and thoughtful overview of the region. I just wouldn't change a word of it. I've been engaged in the Pacific Council with the finance ministers from 4 of the countries that are leading that effort. It's real, and I think it's moving forward, and I think it's a powerful concept that will be a reality. Ambassador Hills, in her normal style, just gave us the roadmap in no uncertain terms about how to move forward here and what's at stake. I'm afraid Luis hit two words that really do, I think, appropriately place a challenge before Brazil. That's potential in one day. And that's really the issue here. I've worked in Brazil a long time. Our son has lived and worked there. We've got major family investments there. So I'm a strong advocate, friend, partner, believer in Brazil. But I think they must move forward, open their economy as they truly step on the world stage with both the World Cup and the Olympics. Mm-hmm. So it's absolutely imperative. There's a number of ways I think that will happen. The trade agreements are actually absolutely one of the ways there. But I think also, Bob, we've seen some progress here. Let's not forget the CAFTA was passed in the Bush 43 administration. We passed individual, strong, meaningful bilateral trade agreements with Panama and Colombia. I think Colombia is yet another example of sustained U.S. leadership that began with Speaker Hastert, President Clinton, carried over the Bush 43 administration in terms of Plan Colombia. We now see a real leader in the region. But I think Brazil is absolutely too large, too major an economy not to be a part of this equation. And I think they've got to come to grips with some fundamental issues. I hope they will do that, and I believe at the end of the day they will.
Just to give two connections for people, there's a little article in the newspaper today about the Hague Court Tribunal resolving a maritime dispute between Chile and Peru. Now, for most North Americans, this may seem very distant, but for people who know Latin American's history, this goes back to the late 19th century and the Pacific War and a very difficult time between Chile and Peru. I honestly think that the type of cooperation that's been developed in the trade area with the Pacific Alliance creates the political foundation for governments to do what's the difficult thing, which is to present this to a tribunal that comes a decision, and nobody exactly likes the result, but it's certainly better than having an ongoing conflict going forward. And then the second observation on Brazil, just to give you a sense of why I think it's important to see these trade agreements within a stream of history in the future, is that they're tricky things. We have to reach a crescendo to close a deal, to pass a deal. But my own sense with Brazil, building on what Luis said in particular, is that I worked at the World Bank with a number of the governors in the Northeast. And understandably, I think Brazil's had a certain view of economic development. I think that you will find the next generation to perhaps be of a slightly different perspective, particularly as Carla and Max says, if you start to see the other pieces moving forward. So it gives you a strategic sense of these things. But I want to come to John because Carla raised the point that a lot of people raise. You served with the GATT and the WTO about how these agreements either support the multilateral system or conflict, compete. I'm very much of Carla's school and could see, if you look at the U.S. history, the times that the U.S. was actually most active on the global scale was when we were also doing a series of FTAs, whether during her tenure or with President Bush. But how do you look at that? We've got service sector negotiations, information technology. We've got things on the WTO plate.
We do, and I share the view that moving forward in a regional agreement can actually provide an impetus to the WTO for it to move forward. And I think there's some other things. There is good work going on in the WTO now. I think the result coming out of Bali, while modest, although a trade facilitation agreement that contributes $1 trillion a year to the global economy, I guess I wouldn't call modest. But certainly in terms of harvesting the other things that were in Doha, it's pretty meager-looking gruel. But I think it shows that you can actually reach an agreement in the WTO, and I think a lot of credit should go actually to Roberto Azevedo, the new Director General, who really rolled up his sleeves with the ambassadors in Geneva and sort of tried a somewhat different approach from the one that Pascal Lamy had followed. But he, worked very hard, and they delivered this result in December. So I think, maybe there's some hope there that the WTO can move forward to some more ambitious things in the years ahead. But I think it's all about ambition, really. If you're going to make, as you were saying, ambition is key, Luis. For all of these things, if domestic governments are going to take difficult decisions, there's got to be a real prize in it for them. You can't do these things if it looks like the result is going to be lackluster or uncertain. Just on the Pacific Alliance, Canada's an observer, as was noted, and the Canadian government came very close to joining the Pacific Alliance in the last year. But, the Prime Minister decided not to do it at that time. And I think part of it was, concern about what would the implications be in domestic politics when people thought that this might imply that we're going to get rid of our restrictions on dairy and poultry products, which, God, when are we going to do it? But but again, that's a problem of ambition. It's, yes, the ambitious goals are there in the Pacific Alliance, but translating that into a broader ambitious program with other major countries is something that is still has to happen. There's another thing about the multilateral and the WTO. I think most big multinational companies still favor the idea of doing business in a world with sort of one set of rules and obligations. The problems in the rules of origin now, if only we'd got the United States objectives started by the National Foreign Trade Council, if I recall correctly, with whom I was working at the time, and supported then by Canada and other countries, if we had been able to eliminate duties on trade and industrial products in the Doha round, and maybe we still could, we would have eliminated basically rules of origin in the industrial product sector. That would have been an enormous benefit globally. Imagine, because it just takes so much energy and frankly results in not really achieving free trade. Even in NAFTA, I confirmed this again yesterday with some of my colleagues, there are a lot of Canadian exporters to the United States who find it too complicated to fill out the rules of origin forms, so they just pay the U.S. MFN duty. It's cheaper than the cost of doing the accounting. So, this is crazy. So I think logically, at some point, we have to bring back all these regional initiatives, if we're successful in them, into a global framework, because that's what's really going to make sense in terms of providing the ultimate benefit to both our consumers and our producers.
Two quick observations. One, to give the Canadian government credit where credit is due. You're right about the dairy and the poultry, but the Canadian Wheat Board was one that plagued us for a long time and did take on that one. But the other sort of issue here that I just want to flag for people, again, from my development experience at the World Bank, you could see markets are somewhat in turmoil these days about developing countries and emerging markets. And a lot of developing countries are going to have to face the challenge of structural reforms, just as the developed countries will. And in many cases, the key sector is the service sector. And if you really want to see where productivity growth is going to come from, additional employment, service sector. So there's a nice potential alignment between the service sector negotiations of the WTO and good development strategies. But let me do a closing round before we kind of open things up to get a couple questions, and that is China. It's hard to talk about trade in this town without having China, but also it's a little bit of an issue in Canada and Mexico too. Some people feel that Mexico didn't benefit as much from NAFTA as it could have because of the competition from China. So let me take each of your view about sort of trade in China. Luis.
China is Mexico's main competitor, and we compete successfully with China in the U.S. market. I mean, that is just the testimony of the level of competitiveness. Can you hear? Is it working? So there's a mic.
Here, speak into mine.
It's made in China, I mean, China is Mexico's.
That's not on.
It's on? Yeah. China is Mexico's main competitor, and we I mean, Mexico has had in the last 20 years a defensive trade policy vis-a-vis China, and I think now is the time to make an offensive trade policy. So selling into China, not only competing with China in the U.S., Mexican, and the world markets, or competing for China on investment. And there is a need now to diversify Chinese risk. And Mexico is very well positioned to be the best hedge to Chinese risk around the world. And with cheap energy, Mexico's competitiveness is unstoppable on industry, but also on the services side. I mean, I think that we have to, as part of TPP, we have to have a clear accession clause that potentially might let China in. And negotiating that accession clause, I think, is very important. Not only in terms of welcoming China to high-level disciplines in terms of trade and investment. But also in terms of the competitiveness of TPP and the contribution that TPP can make to the multilateral trading system. If we have, I mean, I think that if I was Ambassador Acevedo, I would be insisting that TTIP, TPP, the Pacific Alliance, and others have two disciplines to make sure they make a contribution to the WTO. One is an accession clause that is clear, easier to implement with disciplines, of course. And the other one is to make sure that you make a contribution to lowering MFN duties. The NAFTA has Article 303 that limits drawback. And Article 303 of the NAFTA has forced Mexico to lower its MFN duties. So the NAFTA has made a contribution to WTO by making Mexico, and maybe Canada too, and the US, more open to multilateral trade. So if we, as part of TPP or TTIP or a Pacific Alliance, consolidated our apply rates in WTO, that would imply a significant lowering of MFN duties. And that has to do with China. Because if we fear Chinese exports, we'll never do it. But if we begin seeing China as a potential market for our manufacturing products and for our services, then the whole psychology of trade will change. I mean, I think that China is in for the difficult macroeconomic times, I think. And it's a tremendous opportunity for North America to position itself as a platform, as an island of stability and growth if we are ambitious.
John?
Well, this is really the big challenge of the next 50 years, maybe, managing the relationship of the world with China. I remember in the Uruguay round, we got to a point in the negotiations where people said, the negotiations really couldn't be concluded without a meeting of minds between the United States and the European Union. And that's what happened. Everybody, the Blair House Agreement, everybody complained, this was awful, bilateral, but of course that was the only way to really make it happen, and the results were very big for everybody. And then living in Geneva until 4 years ago and watching quite from across the street the Doha round, I found a lot of people were starting to say, these negotiations are never going to be concluded until there's a meeting of minds between the United States and China. And I think that sort of shows how the world's evolving. Now, the European Union at that point had found that the package that was emerging on the table was something that was basically acceptable to it. It didn't mean that the other parties didn't matter, but where the big differences were in the negotiations were between the United States and China. And it was that gap that if you bridged it, then you might have the momentum to move forward. I think it's fascinating to watch the role that the domestic economic debate in China played in their decision to join the WTO and begin to really open up their economy in an important way. And barring some major setback, I don't see that process reversing. So I think it's one where we have to be looking for ways to encourage that to continue and to even become bigger. And I think that the example of negotiating a certain number of other trade agreements, with Europe, in the Pacific, I think that is a way of helping to nudge China towards that direction. And I think having an accession clause is a good idea in these agreements, but I think that we may find in the end that we don't really get China integrated back in the system until we do it in the end in the WTO. But I think part of making that happen may well be having a very successful TPP that includes some of those obligations that we would like to see China accept in a major new negotiating effort in the WTO.
Beck?
When you step back and look at the past 10 to 20 years, and all of us have had a rare privilege to be a part of that in some ways. The development of Mexico from a distant neighbor to a natural partner is become quite clear. Same with China. If you look at the first meeting that President Clinton had with Jiang Zemin, and then you extend that out for several years, much different relationship. I do think China's accession to the WTO was absolutely crucial in terms of their increased investment of ownership in the system and the world economy, world architecture. A wise fellow coined the phrase responsible stakeholder, I believe, describing China, which is absolutely the right formulation in my view. So 2 points that at first I think might seem mutually exclusive. To me, they're actually mutually reinforcing. First, from a U.S. standpoint and from perhaps a North American standpoint, engagement with China is absolutely crucial. We've got to continue to work at developing that relationship, a level of understanding, trust, cooperation, a lot of areas for us to naturally cooperate in. By the same token, the North American platform that Luis spoke of, the stronger we can be at home, the more effective we're going to be abroad, and the more we're going to be engaged abroad. So I think the stronger we can build this platform, our competitiveness, and at times competing against China for sure, I do not believe that's mutually exclusive. I think it's mutually reinforcing to a sound relationship with China. And I think China understands that at some level. I think the new president is obviously trying to open up their economy. Where he's got real challenges is how does he deal with some of the other issues brought forth in this transparent world, and how do you do that? So I think it's absolutely crucial to the health of the world economy that China continue to engage, continue to grow, continue to manage their economy in a responsible way, and we need to do all we can to constructively support that in certainly understanding sovereignty and respect and all of that, but absolutely crucial.
Carla?
Well, I agree with what has been said. I think we need to find a bridge between the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We cannot leave out the second largest economy. And China is currently negotiating the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes all of ASEAN, plus Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, and it's a huge agreement. The quality of the terms is not as high as in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the overlap in participants is amazing. And I think that the accession clause, which Luis mentioned, is absolutely essential. I call it a bridge. But, you know, if I'd had my dream of dreams, I would have done TPP and put it in the middle of the WTO. So like the, and I see Jim Baucus, who's been a proponent of this, shaking his head yes, so I know I'm on the right track. But let me say that we have the government procurement agreement. Anyone can join. Knock on the door. All you have to do is to say you want to be part of it. The the services agreement is in the WTO. We don't negotiate one by one, and so if there's hostility, somebody can keep you out. If you're willing to be engaged, you are part of it. With the TPP, it's going to be a little bit harder unless we see a mutual advantage, and I think we can find one. That is to say, this third plenum came out with a directive that makes it very clear that China wants to tap into its consumer market. The fact is that if they open their services, which are quite restricted, they will induce us to put on the table things that deal with their interests of manufacturing. And so it is of yes, we want to be a powerful North American region, but I think our power can be a carrot to making the second largest economy come in, abide by the rules, and therefore grow in the right direction, which will rebalance the global economy. So I think there's a lot of creative thought that needs to be given to this, and that we ought not to be standoffish, but again, what it's going to take is leadership.
I was in Beijing a week ago today, actually, talking to a large number of the leaders about the 60 points that came out of this third plenum and where they're going to go. And I'll leave you with an observation which shows how trade policy is a fascinating area that involves the technical, but also the very big strategic. For trade policy mavens, they're aware that there's something called the negative list and positive list.
Right.
And a positive list means that a country, whether in services or investment, will designate the areas that are open for competition. A negative list means that everything is open unless you specify it. So trade people want to move towards a negative list. A negative list is what you have in the free trade agreements. China has agreed to the concept of a negative list for service sector negotiations and for bilateral investment treaty. Now, the list of prohibited items is still too long. But if you talk to the senior-most people, they'll say, look, to get our politics to move to accept a negative list, we had to start out with a long list, but we'll cut it down over time. Now, here's the strategic. Imagine what it means in China as it moves towards a decisive role for the market, that they move from a political concept of certain activities are authorized by the government to anything is open for the private sector and competition unless we specify. It's a very big shift of intellectual approach to the economy. So it gives you a little example as the US and Canada and Mexico decide how to engage China on the services sector or bilateral investment treaty, how you can combine the technical to support bigger reform, and as I think a couple people have mentioned here, how the Chinese recall how Zhu Rongji used the WTO accession to drive the internal reforms. That's an opportunity out there today. Absolutely. And so it gives you a wonderful sense of kind of how everything from TPA to kind of the NAFTA North America to Western Hemisphere to the regional negotiations can all fit into a strategic purpose, but it all comes down to somebody doing some of the political lifting. So let's see, we've got a few more minutes to take some questions from people. Yes, please. And you. And maybe if you just introduce yourself.
My name is Jim Backus. I'm a friend of Carla Hill's. I wanted to add a wrinkle to what she said.
And to be fair, Jim not only served in the Congress, but served on the appeals process court for the WTO, where he did a fantastic job, and where he was reappointed by a Republican administration, I might add.
Thank you, sir, for both. On your point about the current negotiations being a catalyst, I agree with your analogy. I think that NAFTA's success certainly did help us back while Tim and I and others were in the Congress to conclude the Uruguay round. Implementing legislation was easy compared with NAFTA. We'll get a dozen votes against it. Yeah. But I think there's a bit of a wrinkle now that didn't exist before. And that is that before, while negotiations were continuing on the Uruguay round, basically everyone was just waiting and still focusing on that single undertaking. It would be a mistake for the WTO to do that now with the Doha round. The good news is that that's not what Roberto Azevedo and others are trying to do. They're feeling their way forward, but they're beginning to see that there is a way forward. The trade facilitation agreement is a very good first step. Significantly, while we were in Davos last week, the United States, Europe, China, I underscore, and 11 other members of the WTO announced that they are now going to move ahead with negotiations on a green goods agreement, which would be a plurilateral agreement under the WTO treaty. This, to me, is the way forward. And importantly, too, although it hasn't really been noticed, if you look down in the bottom of the wording in that announcement, they leave the door open to a broader agreement that would extend beyond just green goods to include other issues relating to sustainable energy. It could become a much broader and much more significant agreement, and ironically, the first true international climate agreement we might have as a world might come out of the seemingly unlikely source of the WTO. We need to move beyond this, though. Another step, if the Chinese will take Yet another initiative would be to expand the coverage of the Information Technology Agreement, as we had hoped to do in Bali. And importantly, too, and this would be the last point I would make, there are negotiations on an international services agreement that are being conducted in Geneva. They are extraordinarily important to the world, especially to our country. What is it, 75% of our economy is now services, 90% of the economy of my state of Florida is services. This is where we have a comparative advantage. But it's important to underscore that while these negotiations at this time are being conducted in Geneva, they are not yet being conducted within the framework and under the umbrella of the WTO. And I think the United States is holding back on that to see what the Chinese do. But that, too, could be another step forward. And as Bob and others have said along the way, we need to move beyond the old way of doing things, which that all or nothing single undertaking, which most of us thought we had done for the last time in the Uruguay round. And so I have encouraged my friends at the WTO to not lose the momentum from Bali and not wait for the momentum that would come from these Pacific or European deals, but to move forward as a global trading system under the auspices of the WTO in the meantime. Thanks.
Anybody want to comment on this? Or I know that there were some students here from at least GW or others, and I'd like to see if any of them have a question. But anybody want to feel a comment on this? I can't quite see in the back. Does any? This is your opportunity. You've got some great expertise, or at least years of age.
There's a volunteer. They need a mic.
Okay.
There's somebody.
You guys have mentioned a lot about we need leaders to make differences.
Could you give your name?
Oh, sorry. My name is Hannah, and I'm a student at the American Studies program. And so you guys have mentioned a lot about us being leaders and how you need leaders to make changes. And we're actually in a leadership course right now. And so I'd like to hear your guys' advice about how you guys would like to see, students now step up and become leaders.
Luis, you're the youngest.
Well, I mean, use Twitter. I think engaging society at large is crucial to make these things happen. When we could negotiate without public opinion 20, 25 years ago, that's over with. So it's without society's engagement, I think it's impossible to do agreements like this. My sense, at least in Mexico, is that the public opinion is a lot more free trader than the elites and the public officials, because they're consumers. The main benefit of the NAFTA for Mexico, beyond certainty, which I talked about before, is consumer welfare. Mm-hmm. And the same thing will apply, of course, in China and in other places and in Brazil. So if we want to convince Brazilians that trade is good for them, it's not only in terms of your firms will be competitive, but there are significant welfare benefits for consumers. So, engaging young people that tend to be more global, using the social media, and listening to your ideas, I think is very important. Because, that will help give leaders the courage to actually do it. And every time you see a politician, ask him or ask her, what are we? How are we engaged in the world? It will make a difference in the end.
In all seriousness, Mac, you've helped a lot of people of different generations coming up, and even employed some of them. So, any thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great question, and I think a couple of points. First, I don't think there's any question that younger people stepping into leadership positions, broader responsible roles in both the private sector and the public sector has a forward movement to it, a leaning in, if you will, to use Sheryl Sandberg's phrase. So I think there's ripe opportunity because the world is changing so dramatically in the 10-year century and all of that so many of the changes you understand, you and your friends and colleagues understand perhaps much, much better, not perhaps, you do understand much, much better than we do. So number one, I think there's an opportunity. Number two, in terms of leadership, I would encourage all young people, including our sons, who from time to time take my advice, from time to time do not. But I do think there's certain, while the world is changing dramatically, very different paradigm, some of the values, some of the constants of leadership are very much the same. So I think I would just respectfully suggest that young people take that into account, as well as your kind of cutting edge understanding of the changes that are taking place.
John or Carla, want to add this?
I would say that getting the information out, I remember when we were trying to get the North American Free Trade Agreement approved, we spoke to companies that had young and old employees, and those that would post on the bulletin board what the benefits were to the employees. I used to say, why don't you put in the monthly paycheck or with a W-2 that 37% of this paycheck comes from international activities? Because people, as they live their daily lives, don't often think about the benefits that come from being part of the entire world. And of course, since the NAFTA, we've become much, much more globalized. Supply chains encircle the globe. And so we need to be better informed. And so I think that employers and those that are in policy positions, if they could make people who don't often think in those directions be more aware of where we stand in the world and why is it a benefit, that it could make a huge difference. And with that bubbling up from below, it would have a positive effect on our elected representatives.
Well, I'd just say very briefly, I think I agree with everything that's been said, but I would add that one of the things that a leader needs to have is a real sense of direction. You know, what are the objectives and where are you going? And then I think, and the very important point, Mac, that you made in the car when you asked President Clinton, was he ready to move forward? And he said yes for the third time. And I think that the leader also has to show a steadfastness and a sense of commitment. Otherwise, the leadership doesn't project in a credible fashion.
Well, this is a great question to end on, and I thank you for asking it, because the reason we're all here is because of the leadership that Bill Frenzel provided. And as I tried to say in my opening remarks, Bill is a member of Congress. It's a different type of leadership. It's a different type of coalition building in a representative democracy. And Bill, I hope we've identified not only things that build on your legacy, but show you got 20 more years of work ahead of you. Thank you. Thanks for the panel.
Well, what an amazing panel, what an amazing conversation. I learned so much. I hope you all did as well. It really points to the future with hopefully a new global golden age of trade, and with all the opportunities before us with the knowledge we had here, that's certainly possible. So thanks again for all your insights. We're going to take a short break where we're going to have reception back where we had reception before. They're going to reset this for lunch, and we're going to be back for lunch with remarks from Minnesota's current representative on the Ways and Means Committee, Representative Eric Paulson, and our award given to our illustrious honoree today. So please break. Thanks. One more round of applause for our panel.
Give him a round of applause anyway. He intended to be here. And last, and certainly not least, the lovely Ruthie Frenzel and her family at this table here. I'm now delighted and honored to introduce Congressman Eric Paulson, who, as I mentioned earlier, now serves the 3rd Congressional District in Minnesota, the same district that was served so ably for so many years by our honoree, Bill Frenzel. As I mentioned before, Paulson is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, as his mentor, Bill Frenzel, was. This committee has jurisdiction over health care, economic and trade policy, and is the chief tax writing committee of the House of Representatives. Paulson, in his years in Congress, has been a proponent of pro-growth initiatives and believes in open markets as a key to a strong economy. He is also a member of the Joint Economic Committee, which is a bicameral congressional committee composed of 10 members from the House and the Senate. They study and perform research on matters related to the economy, and they advise Congress on how to create economic growth. And in addition, he's a member of the Free Trade Working Group and the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Working Group. These working groups were formed 20 years ago to educate members and promote policies that open up foreign markets. So as you can see, he very much is following in his predecessor's footsteps in terms of leadership on these important economic and trade issues. With that, help me welcome Congressman Eric Paulson.
Well, Tim, thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. And thank also for your leadership, and Mark Kennedy, thanks for your leadership with the Economic Club, actually, here in Minnesota. I say here in Minnesota. I think if we are here in Minnesota, the weather feels like it's Minnesota in many respects, actually. But I just want to thank you for what you do with the Economic Club in general, because having you come to Washington, D.C., I think, highlights a lot of the tremendous work that you're able to do back home. And you do a lot of great work back home, bringing in great speakers and focusing on policy issues to make sure that Minnesota is going to be, again, at the forefront of competing in a global economy, which is part of your mission, I know. And today it's kind of fun. You have a lot of special guests and panelists who have already been here to present, ambassadors, et cetera. And it's an honor to be here. And I may be a little bit repetitive in some of the comments that I share with you on trade. We're here to celebrate 2 events, though, right? One is the special event for the 20th anniversary of the passage of NAFTA. And I remember helping work on NAFTA. I was just talking to the ambassador Mexico a little bit about helping as a staffer when I worked for Jim Ramstad a little bit as a part of that education effort that was going on at that time and now is going on again now with our new trade initiatives that are on the horizon. And of course, the other opportunity is honoring my good friend and predecessor's predecessor, who represented the 3rd Congressional District so ably for many, many years in Minnesota with that Champion of Free Trade Award, Bill Frenzel. And so it's a special honor for me to actually be with him. I relish the moments that I have I get an opportunity to spend with Bill. Maybe once every 3 months we have a little coffee or breakfast. He kids me because I don't drink coffee and he does. But I value the insight and the input and the advice, more importantly. And it's kind of fun to have Ruthie and the family here as well as a part of this. And he represented that district for 2 decades, which is a long time of tenure. And I've even got a Frenzel doodle that my mom passed on down to me, sitting in my office still today. No one is more deserving of this honor than him. Over the last 20 years, Bill Frenzel played a very, very important and instrumental role in promoting trade, including his work on the Canada Free Trade Agreement, which did lay the groundwork, actually, for NAFTA. I know also that Bill was called out of retirement a little bit by President Clinton to help sell NAFTA to Congress. And without hesitation, he jumped at the opportunity to promote trade, because as all of you well know, you're experts in this area, trade is essential to the success of the American economy. Outside our borders are markets that represent 80% of the world's purchasing power, 92% of its economic growth, and 90% of its customers. More than 38 million American jobs depend on trade. 1 in 3 manufacturing jobs depend on those exports. 1 in 3 acres on American farms are planted for hungry consumers overseas. And many countries still do maintain steep tariffs and other barriers against U.S. exports, but the United States market is largely still wide open. And American workers and farmers deserve that same opportunity to compete and win and succeed on a level playing field. And Bill Frenzel was a part of a generation of leaders that worked to advance a very aggressive free trade agenda. And that generation worked across the aisle, most importantly, to ensure that America's trade policies kept pace with the growing global demand. But now, truthfully, it's up to the next generation of leaders to pick up where Bill Frenzel and others left off. And fortunately, we do have some recent history of some Republicans and Democrats working together on trade issues. You know, it was just almost 3 years ago now, almost 3 years ago, where we passed 3 very historic agreements, right? You had South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. And that was important momentum. It was momentum that demonstrated the United States was back on the playing field. We were off the sidelines. And now we need to make the most of that new momentum. It took us a long time to get back on the playing field, and we can't afford to go back on the sidelines. We do need these initiatives, most importantly, to help create jobs and promote and grow a much more healthier economy, and then, in turn, increase our competitiveness. And I think that passing those 3 agreements, it definitely proved that with the right outreach and with the right education, we could advance trade legislation with strong bipartisan support and congressional support working with the president. And as a member of the Free Trade Working Group, that's the bipartisan group that Bill Frenzel was a part of. It was mentioned 20 years ago. It was created to help educate members and promote policies that would encourage free trade, open foreign markets to U.S. goods. I remember having a meeting when we were preparing for passing the 3 different agreements, bipartisan group. And at that time, Ambassador Kerr came up to the Hill, and he said, we're going to move forward with the administration is going to move forward on South Korea. And it was a bipartisan group, Democrats in particular, that really pushed back and said, no, if we don't do all 3, we're not going to do any of them. And we know the benefits exist for all 3, and it lays out an aggressive agenda and opportunity for the future. And so that's a little story that shows we've got a little education to do because we've got some new members, but the bipartisan effort is what's going to make it happen in the end. And there's obviously a lot of critical opportunities or critical things happening in the world of trade right now. Just recently, Chairman Camp and Chairman Baucus, along with our ranking member Hatch in the Senate, introduced that bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act, which is essentially trade promotion authority, right? Giving the president that authority with TPA. And I will tell you, as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, I was very pleased to see the introduction of the bill. It comes after very many months of discussion between a lot of different congressional members, and the White House was a very active part of that. But passing TPA, passing this authority for the administration to move forward is going to actually help strengthen America's position in negotiating both the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the opportunity with ties to with the treaty with the EU. And while the introduction of TPA is a very important step, much work does remain. We've got 90 new members that have come into Congress and the House since we passed the 3 agreements just less than 3 years ago. So it's imperative now that we go through that education process once again with all these members about the importance of TPA and the agreements that are moving forward on a separate track. And the Free Trade Working Group actually just met a couple of weeks ago. We actually have another meeting later this afternoon where we're laying out a strategy on moving this initiative forward. So we have our little whip cards. We communicate, we share ideas about who can talk to who, and we're moving forward on that because we really need to work hard to end the myths that surround TPA. You know, a lot of members on both sides of the aisle, for both policy and political reasons actually, have sent letters to the president rejecting giving this authority of TPA to the administration because, you know, they fear it's ceding congressional power. At least those are the arguments that have been laid out in some of the letters. And the fact is, by passing this authority, Congress is actually going to have greater input over negotiations, is going to have greater increased power in drafting implementation legislation, and so it's really our job, just as it was for folks like Bill Frenzel 20 years ago, to sell our colleagues on the benefits of passing these agreements. And Chairman Baucus, I'll just mention, has done a great job as well in working with members on Senate Finance and Ways and Means on our side of the aisle when this legislation was introduced. And you know, some have wondered if the trade agenda might be thrown off a little bit, if TPA might be thrown off a little bit because he's leaving, right, in his new opportunity. But I will tell you, with Ron Wyden stepping in as chair of the Finance Committee, he's got, 1, a good history of working bipartisanly. 2, he's been very active in the trade agenda himself. You know, Oregon is connected on the Pacific, obviously, with a lot of activity on the western side in Southeast Asia. And I've worked with him on some personally on some legislative initiatives. I think there's a huge opportunity. He's going to want to move forward on that as well. So that's not going to slow down the work at all for a very aggressive trade agenda or opportunity to move that forward. And I'll mention also, TPA is also going to make sure that the administration is negotiating a deal, or any deal in the end, that covers the issues that are most important in today's economy. And that's because the trade initiatives and opportunities, they're very different today than they were 20 years ago with NAFTA. simply focusing on, tariffs and import quotas and other traditional barriers to trade, that's no longer enough. We've got to seek more of these 21st century solutions to help streamline trade, to end non-tariff barriers and interconnect regulations across our borders, because that's going to help reduce regulatory borders to our exports, and then establishing these high standards, market-based rules of trade through new agreements is also going to create a lot better leverage and more leverage to get other countries like China, for instance, to adopt our rules, and that's really critical. And so the big opportunities, we know them, TPP and TTIP, right, with the Atlantic. And I'll just mention first on TPP, this is the very first real 21st century trade agreement in the world. I mean, it's a game changer. It really is. And it has the opportunity on a couple of points. Number one, by some estimates, 80% of all of the world's growth is going to occur in the Asia-Pacific region. And, America, again, needs to be where the customers are. We need to be there. And two, this agreement is different. It's going to be laid out very differently. This is not one of those agreements that's one-on-one, in the negotiations. This is more of a plug-and-play type of opportunity where if other countries later can meet these high standards that are being laid out, they can plug in as long as they meet the same standards, and they can join in without new negotiations. And third, China is moving very aggressively in this region, and a successful TPP agreement is going to help significantly increase our competitiveness, U.S. competitiveness and integration into that region, and it's going to offer the United States a foothold, a regional foothold, if you will, in that area that's going to serve as a counterweight to China. And a lot of those countries are looking for a counterweight to China. And finally, I'll just mention, Japan's involvement is also an opportunity because, that's an economy that has typically looked inward, right? And, has had a lot of restrictions on access to markets. And so we've got an opportunity to break through that as well and turn that from an inward-looking economy. So the recent progress I think we've seen in TPP has actually been very, very promising. Some of us were disappointed. It didn't come to conclusion at the end of the year. TPA had been a little slow in being introduced, and now everyone's kind of on board and moving forward. But the reality is those negotiations are going forward in the near term. I think they're going to move forward very promisingly to be successful. There's some still significant issues that need to be addressed, but they're entering the final stages in all reality. And hopefully that progress and that momentum is going to continue in the next round of talks. And so the bottom line is that the importance of a very successful TPP negotiated deal cannot be understated. I mean, just from a Minnesota perspective, we export like $8.8 billion worth of goods and $1.7 billion worth of services just to the 6 TPP countries where we already have one-on-one agreements with the United States. And so, expanding these opportunities for businesses and companies in the Asia-Pacific region is not only going to grow those numbers, but more importantly, it's going to grow quite a few jobs. I'm going to offer some comments on TTIP, too, with the Transatlantic Investment Opportunity Partnership before I take a few questions, if that's all right. And that's also an exciting opportunity. And the transatlantic economy, it's the largest and the most integrated in the world, right? So it comprises 50% of the world's global GDP. It generates something like $5 trillion in total commercial sales each year. And the EU and the US account for 30% of global trade. I mean, it's happening on a daily basis already. Now, personally, I've actually been very engaged in calling for these types of negotiations to move forward with the EU, some of our best allies and friends, obviously, since the summer of 2012. And I remember I authored a bipartisan letter. We had 50 members sign on, urging the administration to move forward on this. The president included in the State of the Union speech, I think it was just last year. And I remember I got an email from Bill Frenzel saying, "You're right on track. This is the right direction to go. It's been long enough where there's been no forward momentum on this." And so we had a formal launch of a business coalition for transatlantic trade not too long ago. A coalition that's very promising, I think, to put some more leverage or oomph behind the effort. We've actually met with our Ways and Means counterparts from the EU a couple of times where they brought some of their MPs in from Europe to talk about that, and they're very interested in moving forward. There's some outlying issues, but they're staying engaged. They know the importance. And we've introduced a bipartisan resolution, again, to move that process forward. So, I mean, look, our tariffs are already pretty low with the EU, right? And so some folks say, well, what's the big deal? Tariffs are already fairly low. You know, the economic activity is so high, even if you move the needle a little bit, it can yield tremendous economic results, you know, for jobs and other dollars. But one of the greatest ways that we can increase our opportunity to break down regulatory issues is with this agreement. And for instance, take the example of a medical device company that might be in Minnesota or that is here in the United States. And you know, they've got to get FDA approval for their products, but they still got to go through the same exact or a new approval process, maybe for procedures in the EU. The TTIP can help by encouraging our regulators, where possible, to determine whether they have equivalent regulatory outcomes. And if they do, and if their oversight committees agree, products and services sold in one economy could then be regulatory green-lighted to be sold in the other economy. And that could be for a wide range of different goods and services. So that's the opportunity, is streamlining that regulatory environment for a lot of cross-border opportunities. And you know, the meetings with the EU, again, have been going very well. As I mentioned, we met with several members of the EU Parliament. That's happened on a regular basis. And the bottom line is, I mean, these are real exciting opportunities for 2014. And the three agreements that took, you know, a few years to pass. I was elected in 2008. I'm in my third term now, and you know, it took a couple of terms to move forward on those three agreements. We're kind of at that same point for 2014. I've met several times with Ambassador Froman. He's got a great team. He's pushing hard. I wish the administration itself would get more engaged and take credit for moving these initiatives forward, because they should take credit. I think they can be wildly popular if they're sold and educated in the right way. But a big part of this is that your support is integral to seeing through its success. There are a lot of great organizations here from Minnesota that are engaged in trade, that have testified on the Hill, that stay involved with a lot of these partners. But we really in Congress rely on you to share these stories, to share these anecdotes, to share the real stories about how workers are helped, you know, ranchers are helped, et cetera, et cetera. And it helps our constituents. And so I think that with a little luck, we can complete many of these negotiations later this year. We can open new markets. We can eliminate a lot of the barriers now that are there for American companies overseas. And I will just tell you, I am going to do what I can to look for more opportunities to engage in this area and improve America's trade prospects and export opportunities around the globe. And hopefully 20 years from now, we will have an opportunity to be celebrating the results of TTIP and TPP. That's going to be the big opportunity. And so I just want to thank you again for having me to share a few comments with you today and give a ways and means perspective, if you will. And I want to continue to work with all of you to expand exports, to increase trade, and to promote a healthier economy. Thanks for having me here. I look forward to your questions.
We do have time for just a couple questions because the congressman has to get back to the Hill. I understand votes are going to resume shortly after 1 o'clock, and we're closing in on 1 o'clock already. Questions in the audience, and do wait for the microphone to find you. Any hands in the air? Introduce yourself and then pose your question, please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Dolores Burns. I work at Public Citizen, and we work closely with a lot of civil society groups that are concerned about fast track, frankly, because under NAFTA, just from the TAA figures, 845,000 jobs were lost, and we are looking at a $180 billion deficit, trade deficit with Canada and Mexico combined. So, because TPP is being negotiated in secret with 600 corporate advisors, a lot of people that we work with at Public Citizen feel that the consumer, the citizen, is actually not being heard in this process. And Congress doesn't even have access to this text. So do you think that fast track is a wise strategy in this case when these trade agreements are so complicated now, and they're not just about trade, they're actually about intellectual property, they're about patents. So I'm sorry for the long question.
Well, and this is part of the public policy debate around this issue. The reality is that I believe, in all honesty, in order for the United States to stay competitive and to lead economically and not get left behind, because the world has changed in the last 20 years pretty significantly, we've got to make sure we move forward on these agreements. And I think Congress's best leverage in promoting this authority or giving the administration this authority is making sure that we're raising the right issues, that it's part of that separate agreement, but we're not going to tie the hands down where we're not going to let these negotiations move forward, because we saw what happened with some of these other trade negotiations that happened with Korea, Colombia. The EU moved quicker than we did. Other continents and other countries moved quicker than we did to solidify these deals. And so, again, we're back on the playing field, and the United States is being looked at to lead. And so this is our opportunity to lead. And we can, there are issues like currency manipulation, and for the first time, some of those issues are actually spelled out as a part of this opportunity to move the issue forward. And so I'm actually excited about that. And again, it's bipartisan, and that's the way it's going to get done.
We're going to go to Craig, and then we'll go to this table, and then we're going to have to let the congressman head back to the Hill.
My name's Craig Shaver. I'm with RBC. Congressman, thanks for all you do representing our district and promoting trade. I'm curious, it sounds like you're not getting much help on the Democrat side in the House. Who are the stars that are helping you there?
Well, I should mention, the Free Trade Working Group is actually, made up of a bipartisan group. So these are not like the leaders or the chairs of committees, right? So, it's no secret that Chairman Camp and Ranking Member Levin just don't see eye to eye, and when this TPA authority was introduced, it was done bipartisanly, and they worked really hard and long to try and get all the respective leaders on both the House and Senate involved. But we ended up making sure it was bipartisan, and Chairman Baucus was integral in that part, moving it forward. So, I think of members like, Ron Kind from Wisconsin, more ag, connected in many respects from the Midwest. Jared Polis, who's a business-oriented Democrat, was engaged in many respects on some of the last agreements. Some of those folks, and a lot of it are newer members. A lot of these are newer members because the turnover has been pretty significant, even in the last 5 years. I always tell students when I meet with them, when you get your little congressional pin, on the back of the pin is a number, right? And the number represents your seniority. Well, when I got elected, my number was 421 out of 435. But in just 2 elections, I've moved to number 250. And so it shows you the turnover you've had in the House. And so we have a lot of new members. That's partly an education effort, and it's partly, I think, a new vision effort that a lot of members on both sides of the aisle offer for different perspectives on these issues.
One last question over here. Introduce yourself and then pose your question.
Thank you, Congressman. My question actually was very similar on the TPA. James Wilkinson with the National Foreign Trade Council, and I was going to ask about leadership on the Democratic side in the House, but you've already covered it. So I'd like to instead ask a question on, in the TTIP agreements, it seems there's a lot of discrepancy on the American side versus the European side in approaches to data privacy. Do you have any comments you would like to offer on that?
There are some differences, and I don't know too much of the detail around there, but it's been referenced several times in our meetings we've had with the other members of Parliament, right, from the EU. But they've been pretty clear in mentioning that part of that is just a political issue back home, and they want to make sure that we're continue to move forward. They don't want that to hamstring or hang up any of the negotiations. So they want to stay all in. They want to move forward. There's some sensitivity around it. I think for some, they're more passionate about it than others. But they've been pretty clear about delivering that message. They want to keep all negotiations moving forward. They don't want to let that sidetrack anything. And so that, will be one of those issues that, maybe it waits till the end. I'm not sure. But, there are more political sensitivities, I think, based on perhaps on what country it is, for instance. But it's not going to detract from moving it forward.
With that, help me thank the congressman for his time. Thank you. I appreciate it. That's good.
All right.
Now I'm going to call my colleague Mark Kennedy back to the podium so he can move us into the awards ceremony. Mark.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Congressman Paulson. I was there for the last Trade Promotion Authority. It was a 1-vote margin, so I know how much fun these votes are and how difficult they are, but it's great to see the focus both on the panel and by Congressman Paulson here today, and we're very pleased to see that moving forward. Let me just also say at this moment that it's great to have Bill's family here, and he very much appreciates you being here, and we appreciate you being here as well. Earlier, also in the panel, Mac McClarty mentioned that the American people take things better when they're bipartisan, and I want to pay special tribute to Tim, because the success of Economic Club has largely been in great part fueled by the fact that Tim and I are up at just about every event. So you see a former Republican congressman, a former Democratic congressman working together to advance issues that are important to Minnesota. So let's give Tim a round of applause for the great contribution he makes to. Now, we couldn't be more pleased than to have Mac McClarty to present this award to Bill Frenzel. And it's appropriate that it is somebody from the Clinton administration, as he worked so vitally, in this vitally important issue, he worked so closely together. But let me give you three other reasons why it's appropriate to have Mac McClarty be the one awarding Bill this prize. The first is that Thomas F. McClarty III goes by Mac, which makes him the same kind of Minnesota nice that we've always engaged Bill to be. The second thing is that he has worked in three administrations, in the Carter administration, and the Clinton administration, as well as the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. So like Bill, he has got a long and strong tradition of working in a bipartisan manner. And then the third thing, he does big things. So as chief of staff for President Clinton, he worked on big things like a deficit reduction bill that we desperately need again today, NAFTA, and the focus of our attentions here today, but also Family and Medical Leave Act and a welfare reform. So please welcome Mac McClarty to present the award to Congressman Frenzel.
Mark, thank you very much for your very warm and generous introductions. You and Congressman Penny, I think, represent not only the best of the great state of Minnesota, but really represent how government, private sector business should be done on a bipartisan basis. So thank you for your leadership of the Minnesota Economic Club. I certainly want to acknowledge the Frenzel family to my right. It's a delight, Ruthie, to see you again and to meet all of your family. And Bill, I know that's particularly special for you today. You know, when we consider, I think, some of what NAFTA has achieved, trade moving to almost $1 trillion a year, that's more than $3 billion a day, creating good jobs in all three countries, integrated manufacturing chains that we talked about earlier today, a panel so ably chaired by Bob Zellick, and it was a great pleasure to be with Ambassador Hills, Louis de la Calle, and John Weeks, and meaningful contributions to our neighbors to the south and the north. It's kind of hard to imagine that the passage was ever in doubt, but let me assure you it was. So it's a great privilege to celebrate and commemorate not just an important agreement, but a public servant whose, without his leadership, the NAFTA would not have been possible, the Honorable Bill Frenzel. Bill is, of course, from Minnesota, as all of you know, and as Garrison Keillor might say, on his prairie home companion, Minnesota is where all Democrats are strong, all Republicans are good-looking, and everyone agrees that Bill Frenzel is well above average. Traveling to Minnesota once a month when I was in the natural gas business, I knew that was an applause line. Another above-average Minnesota native, F. Scott Fitzgerald, once wrote that action is character. Now, he was talking about fiction, but he just as easily could have been talking about Bill Frenzel, a person of action and a person of enormous character. A deep commitment to public service is in his DNA, as so many of you know. He served the people of Minnesota, as Congressman Paulson noted, for nearly 20 years in the U.S. Congress, and then he joined Brookings Institution, where he serves today. And somehow he found time to serve three presidents, Clinton, Bush, and President Obama. And he's the type of person who always puts the common good ahead of partisan gain. And that was pretty apparent in the NAFTA debate. As we discussed this morning, the North American Free Trade Agreement was negotiated quite ably by Ambassador Carla Hills and Ambassador Bob Zoellick in the Bush administration, and it fell the responsibility of the Clinton administration to move it forward. And we knew we had an uphill battle on our hands. Some Republicans wanted us to take it up sooner. Some Democrats had concerns that they expressed, and some on each side said the treaty would not be good in a number of ways. So we knew we would need strong bipartisan support to get it done, and we reached out to Bill Frenzel, hoping that he could help persuade his colleagues in the House. But Bill didn't want to work as a paid lobbyist, not even for the President of the United States. Instead, he proposed to volunteer his time, and that's exactly what he did. He was joined by his Democratic counterpart, Bill Daley, and they made a great team. But up until the final moment, we didn't know whether we had enough votes to pass the bill. Tim, you'll remember that well. So the night before the House vote, if my memory serves me correct, the President and the First Lady hosted a dinner at the White House for all of the undecided members. And at the end of the evening, the Marine Band was playing show tunes. And as I recall, Ruthie, you were standing with Congressman Bob Michael and singing that song from My Fair Lady with a little bit of luck. Pretty soon, President Clinton and everyone else was singing too. A little bit of luck was exactly what we needed on the next day's vote. But even to get to a point where we were shoulder to shoulder, singing together, this was a feat in and of itself. So to pass the NAFTA, our target was 100 Democratic votes and 120 Republican votes. And even as the members began to record their yeas and nays, we still didn't know whether we had enough votes to make it. But sure enough, 102 Democrats came through, and Bill, who had worked tirelessly for months, delivered 132 Republicans. And remember, he did it as a volunteer, which perhaps makes him one of the few Americans who didn't benefit directly from the agreement. Johnny Apple of the New York Times wrote that he thought this accomplishment was, in many ways, the most significant accomplishment of President Clinton's first year in office. And I think history is judging that to be correct. And this important measure was made possible because of the leadership and President Clinton's decision to appoint Bill Frenzel. So I'd like, hoping all the technology works, to cue a video that has a brief segment from the signing ceremony with President Clinton, and also some comments by some pretty eloquent and thoughtful people in their own right, USTR Representatives Carla Hills, Mickey Cantor, and Robert Zoellick. So with that, let's see if we can cue the video before we move forward.
I think always when you're in an organization, some people stand out for really knowing some things, and Bill Frenzel stands out as being a champion for free trade. And that's why a Democratic president, President Clinton, picked him to assist in explaining the benefits of the North American Free Trade Agreement.
I couldn't let this moment go by without thanking my good friend Bill Daley and Congressman Bill Frenzel for their work in helping to mobilize this effort. They sort of represented the bipartisan spirit that captured the Congress and captured the country in the cause of change. I hope that we can have more of that in the days and months and years ahead. It was a very fine thing.
Bill Frenzel was an architect, a leader, and one who made sure the NAFTA passed. Without him, we never could have passed NAFTA. He was a central point of leadership in the House.
His curiosity and, frankly, willingness to help people all around the world led him to support U.S. links with Japan, with the Transatlantic Policy Network, with Europe, with the Eurasia Foundation. He's been somebody who has contributed all his life to not only the United States, but its relations with the rest of the world.
Bill Frenzel is so friendly and so approachable. I can't imagine anyone not wanting to sit down and having a cup of coffee with him.
The best thing about Bill Frenzel is he's a wonderful man and a good guy and somebody you can rely on.
Bill's experiences as a leading member of Congress, somebody who could work in a bipartisan fashion with the executive branch, with the business community, across labor, environmental, other topics. It's going to be something that I hope will also be a signpost for the future about what can be accomplished by people who bring the hard work, the intelligence, the experience that Bill has brought.
So now, if I may, Congressman Kennedy, if you and Congressman Penny would come forward, please, let me make a couple of brief remarks about the award itself, and then you certainly have the honor of presenting it to Congressman Frenzel. The award is a Paul Revere Bowl, and like Paul Revere, the bowl comes with some history. In 1768, the Sons of Liberty were looking for a way to honor 92 representatives who had taken a stand to protest duties imposed by the British. They commissioned Revere, who made one of his most famous pieces of silver in colonial history. So, Bill, we think it is fitting that we honor your work with a facsimile of this in the award that is given to patriots who shared your spirit of selfless dedication, who felt a duty, who clearly conveyed character, principle, and ability to get things done in the right manner. Thanks to you, we've had 20 good years of free and fair trade that has opened markets and created jobs and lifted people's lives. You laid the foundation for future agreements that Congressman Paulson and others have spoken about. That's what everyone is talking about today. So as we honor you, we renew our own commitments to what you have fought and believed in your whole life for cooperation and action and meaningful results that impact people's lives in a positive manner. Your work has improved the life of really every American, and your friendship has certainly distinguished us all. Please come forward.
Thank you. You're welcome. It's wonderful. Heavenly day.
It's a real Paul Revere bowl.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. That is just, hold that for me. You can hold that? Yeah. Put it up there where it can be seen. Thank you, Mac McClarty. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Tim. Thanks to everybody who is here. And thanks to everybody else who's worked on NAFTA and helped us promote trade in the United States and around the world. Contrary to popular belief, I didn't nominate myself for this award. I happen to be the only Minnesotan alive who can remember those good old NAFTA days. But I accept the award anyway on behalf of the people, presidents, USTRs, trade ministers, negotiators, and others who really pulled it off. I was really mostly a spectator, but those big shots who did the heavy lifting have got a lot of prizes and plaques already, and my walls are almost bare. I accept it also because NAFTA is a treaty worth remembering. And this is redundant because every speaker has referred to it before, but it did join 3 countries on our continent, which were quite different in all respects. It wasn't a perfect agreement, but at its time, it was the gold standard of trade agreements. It was a giant economic step forward for for our hemisphere and ultimately for the whole world. Each of the partners had to give something up, but each gained a great deal more. It, as Mac indicated, had laid the base for agreements which came later. If you don't mind, if you will indulge me, I'll tell you a few stories of my own about selling NAFTA to the Congress. You'll recall this was 1993, the early Clinton days, when he still had majorities in both houses. It was obvious the House was critical, and it was also obvious that they had to receive the votes of 2/3 of its Republican minority. The minority was mostly for free trade, but it was also wary of a young interloper in the White House, which it didn't know very well and wasn't willing to trust immediately. So somewhere in the administration, the idea arose that a Republican might help sell the deal. For some unknown reason, and I believe it was that Mac McLarty heard that I would work cheap, I was selected and began work with the Clinton administration to move this business forward. 218 is the majority of votes in the House. Max already told you that my quota was 120, 2/3. Bill Daley's quota of Democrats was 100, which was 40% of his caucus, but he had a much harder job, as all of you know and understand. By the way, when I accepted this job, I was named a special advisor to the president. Ruthie Frenzel always said that that was a perfect job description for me because the acronym is SAP. No matter how many nice things are said here, it's apparent that I can be kept humble at home. We had some troubles. We had a lot of what you might say, good feelings, but we didn't have enough promises. And before the administration and before its friends in the Congress could bring the bill to the floor, it needed some promises. And we had to work very hard with Congress. As has been pointed out, it was by no means a snap course. One of our problems was that a lot of Republican and Democrat members of Congress had never been south of the border. They didn't know what was down there and were nervous about it. And so we arranged to fly a number of undecided members down to Mexico City to meet with President Salinas and his cabinet. Now, it may have been the altitude. I don't think it was the tequila. I think it was that President Salinas was just a good salesman because every one of those members that we took down to Mexico City ultimately turned out to support the agreement. Then we had a problem with Republicans who said, we're getting too much mail against this. We can't possibly vote for it with a 10-to-1 unbalanced mailbag. Well, we turned to our business coalition headed by Ken Cole, who took on the balancing act. And it was only about 4 or 5 weeks later, as we approached the actual vote, that there was not among the undecided Republicans a single unbalanced mailbag. And suddenly that crybaby caucus had disappeared. That was one of our acts. Another job that I had was that when you pass trade bill, there's a budget aspect to it. You have to have pay-fors to make up for the whatever revenue is foregone in whatever customs duties you reduce or eliminate. And Republicans don't like to raise taxes to do that, and Democrats like it as a good excuse not to vote for trade in the first place. So I had to go out and figure out how we were going to pay for this, and made an arrangement with the Republicans in the House and the Senate, and went to visit the director of the OMB, a chap by the name of Leon Panetta, who he and Jim Jones used to harass me as the chairman of the Budget Committee. And I presented my list of demands to Leon, and he accepted every one. And I was only in his office for about 5 minutes. I had gotten there with the idea that I would see his nice fancy office, and as I left, I figured out I never even saw what the office looked like. But that was an example of the cooperation inside the Clinton White House. And there was nothing wrong with the provisions that I had provided, but Leon was anxious to be agreeable. The last act and the best for me was the one that Mac McLarty has already stolen from me, telling about Ruth's part in this thing. The President and the First Lady invited a bunch of undecideds down. The vote was to be on the following evening. We had a lovely night at the White House, a great dinner, full of camaraderie, lots of toasts. And out in the foyer were Bob Michael and Ruthie Frenzel leading in the singing of songs from My Fair Lady, accompanied by the Marine Band. Mrs. Clinton thought that was a pretty good deal, so she told me to go get the president and bring him over here. Well, I didn't know as if I was that kind of a courier, but I guess it works in every family. I said, your wife wants you. and in he came. Well, the grand finale was, with a little bit of luck, and everyone joined hands and sang that wonderful song. 24 hours later, with a little bit of bloomin' luck, as Mac has explained, the bill passed the House with more than 234 votes, or with exactly 234 votes. Then we moved on to the Senate. The Senate has some other limitations. However, on trade, it's usually pretty good. And over there was no problem. The Republicans were organized, the Democrats were organized. It was a piece of cake, and the bill passed by about 75%, I think. It was a great night. For me, the next day, I was in the Oval Office presenting the president with his promised doodle and my letter of resignation. The president asked me, what is the hardest thing you had to do in this business of selling NAFTA, Bill? And I said, Mr. President, truthfully, I must tell you the hardest thing I did was filling out those damn silly disclosure forms to get into your administration. But it was a great experience, and I have to be very thankful to the President and Mrs. Clinton and Bill Daley and Mac and Mickey and that whole administration who treated Ruthie and me royally. And they all acted as if I knew what I was doing. Little did they know. But it was a great experience for me, and I just loved it. Now, finally, you got to pay the bills somewhere, and here now comes the sermon. And it is that I think, for me, the real lesson of NAFTA has to be learned, and it's been repeated over and over today. It is that here's a treaty that was developed by an administration of one party and mostly negotiated, perfected and enacted by an administration of another party, voted into being by bipartisan votes of the House and the Senate. And nowadays, in a spirit of vigorous political competition, we are tempted to forget that we usually do our best work when we do it together. And that to me is the lesson of NAFTA. And if we remember that lesson as we move ahead to TPA, TPP, and TTIP, we just have to remind ourselves that for 80 years we've had administrations and Congresses of both parties who have recognized the economic benefit of freer movements of goods and services across borders. As they used to say during World War II, we did it before and we can do it again. And thanks very much to all of you. I want to say particularly thanks to those of my former employees, many of whom came long distances for this event. You've made it just a wonderful day for Ruthie and me. Thank you.
What a wonderful remarks, Ruthie. Thank you, and thanks to the whole family and everybody for being here.
Where's the orchestra?
We need the orchestra. Well, we are just about to move into the orchestra, which is the reception. I want to first of all call out and thank a couple of people that made this possible, Kristen Robbins, Alexandra, and Abby, and we'll also recognize Angelique taking the pictures. So would they stand if we're within sight?
When you quadruple the trade relationship among three countries in the course of 20 years, I can't think of many, if any, other public policy decisions in that time frame that had as great a consequence. So thank you to all who were involved in that effort, to those who spoke today. It was quite a tutorial, capped by the best part of the program, which was Bill's acceptance speech, in which he gave us that insider's view of what actually happened. Would his former staff please stand, because we Congress people know that we are only successful because of the people that make us successful. Thank you so much. To you and for your commitment to public service, and I know that with Bill as a mentor, it's meant a lot to your ongoing success in your various careers. The last thing I want to say is that two things came through loud and clear from all of our presenters today, concluding with Bill's comments, and that's that you don't get big things done without leadership and bipartisanship. But I think we all also understand that bipartisanship comes from leadership. And Bill was that kind of leader, and let's hope that we're growing some new leaders of his ilk. Thank you.
So with that, the reception continues immediately afterwards. We look forward to conversing with you in the reception. And as Erica talked about it today, we hope to be back in 20 years with the 20-year anniversary of TPP and TTIP here at the Economic Club. And now Kristen Robbins, our wonderful leader, why don't you?
The reception's in the Horizon Room, which is upstairs.
Reception is in the Horizon Room, which is upstairs. We'll look forward to seeing you up there. Thanks all for coming. Thanks for a wonderful event. Thanks to our speakers.